Hopefully everybody noticed that the, so there's a paper that's due on October 31st. The instructions are posted on Blackboard right now. I said that I would post them on October 1st, and I did, but then I forgot to tell you that I did. So as a reminder, you have a paper that's due at the end of the month. The instructions are posted on Blackboard right now. There's an example that goes with it, so you know what you're generally going to write about. And remember, so part of that is setting up for the paper that's due at the end of the semester. So, you know, consider that as the beginning of the end, the beginning of the the final paper. Now, I'm not expecting you to be 100% faithful to that. So in other words, whatever you do that's due, you know, at the end of October doesn't need to be 100% in the final paper. And if you change your mind in the meantime, it's perfectly fine. You know, it's not committal in any kind of way. But if you start thinking about it in this way and starting the job that is due early December, you know, that's probably going to be a little bit more helpful to you as well. So, you know, that's why you have a few weeks heads up for that. And, you know, you have a few weeks heads up for the final as well. But, you know, get started on that whenever you can so that, you know, you don't cram things over your Halloween evening or whatever. If you have any questions about this, please ask now. Otherwise, you know, email me, ask me later. Doesn't matter. Just ask. Okay, well, we're going to keep on going then slowly. The week's subject is religion. And religion in this sense is going to be taken very widely because generally speaking, when people think of religion, it typically has to do with organized religion, with Christianity and this stuff. And if you have been following this class so far, you should probably expect that when we are talking about religion this week, we're going to talk about a little bit more than organized religion. Mostly because organized religion certainly is named religion because it has these same elements as other ways that other people have thought about their world in this similar manner, namely that there are things that are above us. Every time. Okay, so what is this? Yes.
Like a tornado cloud.
Tornado cloud. Which one's the volcano?
The mountain looks like a volcano, the cloud looks like a tornado cloud.
Okay. When does the mountain look like a volcano? It's not a trick question. What's the difference between a mountain and a volcano?
Because of the lava.
The lava?
It will explode.
It will explode? Depends whether it's active or not. So, in other words, to be more specific in terms of, physics and stuff, volcano is a mountain. Most mountains today are some sort of volcano, whether it's a very, very, very old volcano that is completely inactive today, or one that's newer, which would still be a few million years old, but one that can still be active. Both of those things are volcanoes. The lava that's inside a volcano comes from inside the earth, and if there is enough space between the inside of the earth and the top of the mountain, then the volcano can pop out. And you are correct. On the right side, that is a volcano / mountain. Anybody can identify which particular mountain? Vermont people are mountain people, I hear. That's okay. We'll get back to that in a second. What about the tornado cloud? Does that description seem correct? Is it a tornado / cloud?
No, it's tornado. I think it's just like strange phenomenon of like air currents and like rotating and stuff. But it doesn't look like a tornado because there's three of them. And it is like a very fluffy white clouds. These can chill.
Okay, so not fluffy clouds, but there's more than one. Now, what makes you think that it's a weird air current thing, which is the appropriate scientific term for this, by the way? I hate other teachers. All right, that's fine. So you went to school and you learned that the way that clouds look is kind of due to air currents and, science. And it's true. That's, in fact, exactly how this happens. Now, let's say you didn't go to school. Let's say you did not just see a lab which explained how clouds are made. Let's say before your classmate just told you about this thing, you'd never heard about this, which is entirely fine. You don't need to know how clouds work. What's this? Tornado cloud. Let's say you don't even have a word for it, a tornado, because you've never seen one. This is in the Pacific Northwest. They don't typically have tornadoes. How do you explain this? What's the meaning of this? The Shasta tribe is recorded in 1911, early 20th century. They are living in Northern California, Southern Oregon. They are telling us about long, long ago when the world was so new that even the stars were dark. It was very, very flat. Sharia, old man above, could not see through the dark to the new flat earth. Neither could he step down to it because it was far below him. With a large stone, he bored a hole in the sky. Then, through the hole, he pushed down masses of ice and snow until a great pyramid rose from the plain. Old man above climbed down through the hole that he had made in the sky, stepping from cloud to cloud until he could put his foot on the top of the mass of ice and snow. Then, with one long step, he reached to earth. Now, let's say you don't have modern science. Let's say you don't have your schooling. Let's say you don't have most of the vocabulary that would explain to you clouds, air currents, volcanoes, mountains, scientific terms that are more or less accessible depending on how much you read into these things. Doesn't this kind of look like somebody made a hole from the sky and tried to figure out a way down? Doesn't it look like somebody just put a bunch of rocks in the middle of nowhere to make a mountain? And, again, in fact, 6,000 years ago, this thing was an active volcano, which in the grand scheme of things, like I said, those volcanoes are typically born millions of years ago. 6,000 years ago is not that long ago. And even though currently this particular volcano is not active, that doesn't mean that it won't be active again in a few thousand years, maybe a million years. Who's to say? We'll be there to check it out anyway. But how do things come together? How do things get to be the way they are? And especially, how do things get these very specific shapes that you see here? Because that's not your typical fluffy cloud. And in a way, that's not your typical mountain either. Especially, if you're living here, you have kind of mountain ranges in the distance, and you can see those things are here and there. And this one particular mountain here just seems to be just popped out in the middle of nowhere. And again, it was, scientifically speaking, it popped out of on the ground. And if you look at the clouds, which are typically fluffier, which are typically a little bit less defined than this, that shape seems to be intentional. Somebody might have made this for a specific purpose. Now, that would need somebody who's very big, maybe somebody who lives in the sky, maybe somebody that is much bigger than us. Because the only way that this thing could have any intent would need to be much bigger than us, much bigger than our daily life, our daily experience. And so if you think of the world as us, whoever we are, and you try to connect that with wherever we are, it means that we have to deal with the things that are bigger than us. And bigger than us could be the place we are currently living in, or if you think big enough, it could be the world as a whole. Now, if you think that the earth is flat because all you see in the world that you are living in is mostly flat, then the world is flat. Nobody is going to tell you differently, unless you are met with difference. That's a theme we've already talked about in this class. The way that you see your culture is the way that you see your culture. It's everybody you've met, and until you meet somebody different who tells you otherwise, well, that's how everybody is. Now, when you're growing up, when you live with your family, the people within your kin group are the people that the world is like until you meet somebody else, maybe a neighbor, maybe an extended family member, maybe you go to school, maybe you go out in the world, you go to the store and whatever, and you see more people, you expand your social horizon just as much as you can expand your, physical horizon. Perhaps, if you look far enough, you could think of things that are even bigger than the people that you see. Places that are even bigger than the places that you experience. And so when we study religion, it has to do with what we typically call the supernatural. Supernatural, which very literally means above nature. Something that is bigger than nature. And of course, again, in the context of this class, nature has been a pressing concept for us for a very long time. Trying to understand human nature, whatever it is, whatever it might be or could be. And yet, however much we can stretch our imagination, it seems unlikely that our natural being could create these mountains. Our natural being could create these clouds. We could maybe stretch that to seeing gigantic humans, an old man above, that does this. It doesn't seem like this would be, our people. You've met maybe a couple of people who are above 6'5", maybe a couple of people who are 7 feet tall. You've probably never met somebody who's half a mile tall. So we can stretch our imagination to a certain point, but at some point it seems like you cross this threshold. You become supernatural. And the supernatural in this sense could be anything you can stretch past your imagination. It could be a supernatural force, and in this case, the wind is a supernatural force for us for very many reasons, and especially if you've lived through a hurricane and you've seen extreme winds, which don't seem to be natural because your natural experience is a light breeze, a chilly breeze if you're living in Vermont, not a warm, wet 150 mile per hour wind, as people in Florida just experienced, as many people around the Gulf Coast experience on a year-to-year basis. It could be beings. It could be people who are supernaturally proficient. And again, for the most time, you have a regular experience of what a being is, but you might have met somebody who's exceptionally strong, who's exceptionally tall, somebody who's exceptionally good at math, science, languages, something like that. And of course, those people, to explain how they got to be this good, seem to have like a weird thing to them that makes them a little bit supernatural. Now, thanks to science, which has helped us make sense of a lot of things in our lives, including clouds and people and mountains and such, well, now we have a little bit more vocabulary to deal with these things. We have, for example, what people typically call the paranormal. Paranormal are things that are not explained by modern science, which doesn't mean they are not explainable. It just means that at this point in time in our knowledge, some things we just cannot explain fully. Like aliens and stuff. Sure, there might be aliens. As far as we know, scientifically speaking, there's no proof that there's no aliens out there. There's also no proof that there are. So as far as we're concerned right now, aliens are typically more of the idea of the paranormal. But that's because of the science that we have right now as well. Because 6,000 years ago, whether you were an alien from outer space or an alien from the other side of the mountain, you were just another weirdo who looked weird, who thought weird, who spoke weird, who you could not identify from the people that you know. And so those people might have been seen as supernatural. Maybe if they lived in a cold place or a warm place and you didn't understand how they lived the way they did. Another part of the vocabulary that we have today is things that are called preternatural. Preternatural are extraordinary events without an apparent cause. And preternatural events typically would be associated with weather events these days, like those weird funny clouds, like the hurricanes, like things that for all intents and purposes, we cannot explain where they come from. But, you know, if you look into it deep enough, if you can put some numbers behind it, you might be able to explain that, yes, of course, the same wind that we are experiencing in a very light manner every day could also be a very strong wind if the right conditions come about. So again, we are stretching our imagination to seeing what we are comfortable with as something bigger than us, bigger than what we know. And certainly what we know collectively might be a little bit different as what we know as individuals. So you kind of have to have some leeway here between the things that people, kind of just understand. People kind of know, and the things that everybody knows. Of course, that's how hurricanes work. Of course, that's how clouds and mountains work. But the result of that is that there are plenty of ways that people can believe things. And most of our language about that mostly has to do with our current beliefs, because as usual, when it comes to understanding the world around us, well, the collective understanding that we have of belief is informed by the collective understanding that we have of belief. That our culture has taught our culture to teach our culture to be our culture. But even then, we had to develop a vocabulary about different people who believe things, because we understand, and again, that's not stretching the imagination too much, that some people might think about the world a bit differently from us. One language that has come from that is Gnosticism. People who identify as Gnostics recognize and embrace the supernatural. The word Gnostic came from Christianity, from early years of Christianity, when the Bible was not widely available to everyone, and the story of Jesus Christ was also very much not available to everyone, but there were still a bunch of people who believed in it. And of course, if you read the Bible, you know about this, because in early years of the Bible, Christians were persecuted for believing the story of Christ. And as a result of that, they wrote the Bible. So that allows you to know their story. The counter side to that is that there were a bunch of other people outside of the Levant, outside of Palestine, that were also listening to the stories that existed. And they heard the story of Jesus Christ, and it made a lot of sense to them. People in Egypt, for example, who at the time were not yet Muslim because Islam did not exist. And they heard the story of Christ, and they started to practice this weird religion that would have been called Christianity today. And in fact, today, there are Egyptian Christians who have been believing in the story of Christ since Christ, essentially. And yet, they didn't do it the same way that these other people did. They didn't speak Aramaic. They didn't speak the language that most people did at the time. They certainly didn't speak Latin once the Bible was written, or the New Testament was written in Latin, or Greek, or any of those. And as a result of that, they looked a little bit different, and they started to practice this weird thing that early Christians started to call Gnostics. They were obviously weird, but they were kind of close to us. So what do we call these guys? Well, we call these guys people who believe in the supernatural. And, you know, with a little bit of prodding, they could be like us, Christians. The kind of counterpart to that are people who identify as agnostic. And the word has remained with us today for agnostic, people who have kind of a neutral position toward the supernatural. There might be a God, there might not be, well, doesn't matter. Those things are cool anyway. So as much as the agnostic is neutral towards it, the Gnostic embraces the supernatural. And those are just two different ways to get to this ideas of what the supernatural does for our lives. More specifically, there's also forms of people who believe in a God. Those are people who do not typically identify as theists, but theism is generally the belief in the existence of God. Now, a personified version of the supernatural is a step above or a step to the side or, you know, connected to the supernatural, but it's already kind of crossing a step into a different direction. That it's not just that things that are bigger than us, but there's also a being that's bigger than us. And that being has a force, an influence on our life. So Christians are theists, Muslims are theists. Lots of people who just believe in God are typically all theists, but they will be usually associated with that particular God that they believe in, because then, of course, that's what they want to be recognized as. They don't want to be the follower of any God. They want to be the follower of their particular God. First, the other side of that would be atheists. And again, this word has remained with us today because the atheist denies the existence of God. Now, I'll put God between quotation marks, of course, because it is whatever God you are believing in or not believing in this sense, of course. So if you call this God Allah, which is the word for God, but in Arabic, well, this is still the same God, but it's not the same God because they don't believe that the God is the exact same God. In Islam, Allah is one. Allah doesn't have a representation as the Holy Spirit. Allah doesn't have a representation as Jesus Christ. Allah has a bunch of prophets, including Jesus Christ. But have you heard about Muhammad? That guy was a much better prophet than Jesus. But at the end of the day, you know, Muslims read the Old Testament. They tell the same stories that exist in the Bible in Arabic. If you don't believe in either the Christian God or the Muslim God, well, you can see how those two gods are actually exactly the same God. But of course, in the details, they are very much not, as evidenced by a couple hundred years of fighting and glory right now. But this is a scientific understanding of all of this, is that if you are the Christian God of the Palestinian people or the Christian God of the Egyptian people, and those two people don't meet at any point in time to compare whether they believe the right thing or the wrong thing, and nobody is there to tell them that, well, you're wrong, you're right, or you do the right thing, you do the wrong thing, they could very legitimately go on with their lives believing in two different Christian gods that are substantially different. And of course, same thing with the God of Islam and the God of Christianity, who just so happens to be neighbor, just like they are neighbors with the God of Egypt. But Oh, they obviously do it differently. They have this other prophet. They have these other people in the story. They speak a different language. How do you explain that those two are the same gods if they have completely different understandings of God? You could say they're both stupid, or you could say they're both right. Or you could say that it doesn't matter. Whatever floats their boat, they do whatever they want. And of course, in this context, the idea of God is especially complex for us because God can come in many shapes and sizes, just like the supernatural can come in many shapes and sizes. And again, when we use this word God, typically it is associated with the monotheistic God. Monotheism, one God. And you believe there is only one God in your God. Now, same idea, right? With the Christian God and the Palestinian Christian God, especially, when you have God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus Christ, and those three are one, 1,500 years of fighting over that one. But we don't have any time to look at this at this point. For all intents and purposes, the Christianity form of religion is a monotheistic religion. The details of how those three parts connect into one and that one connects into three is kind of the science, the mathematics of what God is or is not. Because it's obviously different from one of the greatest enemies of Christianity in those early years, which is polytheism. Polytheism is the belief in many gods. And as far as those Christian people from Egypt were concerned, the Palestinian Christian people saw this as polytheism because you had Egyptian people who kind of recognized that there were many gods before that. And you might know about Egyptian polytheism from before. You might have heard about the deities of the ancient Egyptian people, which by the time of Jesus Christ had mostly disappeared. But when you have a culture that recognizes the possibility of many gods, then you don't quite exclude the many gods as much as you do. And this is also the story of the Old Testament at this point in the Bible, which has all of these Old Testament idols, those other gods, those false gods as they are called repeatedly, both in the Old and the New Testament, those people that we don't trust, we don't believe in. Which is why the Gnostics of Egypt were seen as a problem for the Christians of Palestine. They were too close to the thing that ancient Hebrews were trying to remove from their lives. Sometimes if you have many gods, you might think of your gods as being everything and everywhere. That's pantheism. Pantheism is the belief that everything in reality is God. God is in the chairs, in the trees, in the mountains. All of this is God. Now, this is different than thinking all of these are made by God, of course. We are talking about very specifically the reality itself is God. Hinduism has parts of pantheism. Some parts of nature in Hinduism are God in this sense. If you believe that there is a little bit of God in everything, that's panentheism. So pan, again, everywhere, but panentheism means that God is in a little bit of everything, everywhere at all times, and also extends beyond time and space because God kind of transcends everything. But that doesn't mean that God is everything in itself. Newer ways to believe kind of in God would be called deism. Deism is a pretty common way that people since the Enlightenment have been thinking about religion. The founding fathers, for the most part, were deists who believe that there is a supreme being, creator out there, but his role in our daily life is pretty limited. Sure, there's a God out there. We're not going to complain about it too much. We're not going to deny his existence too much, but also, we're not going to impute everything that happens in the world to this God. And if you think that's wrong from a Christian point of view, you're correct. And that's why they were, in fact, kicked out of England at the time. But different story, again, that we have no time for at this point. There's also the possibility of being that you yourself are God. Autotheism is for a handful of newer religious movements, including some Satanisms, for example, Luciferianism, where people believe that each one of them is God and they have unlimited power to do everything at all times. But Satanism is much bigger than that, as is the religious system we are talking about so far. So in the space of 2 slides and 10 minutes, we've covered the entirety of the possibility of how people could have believed in things. Obviously, each one of them could be a semester worth of teaching. But the idea here is to kind of expand our horizon of what this thing of religion is and kind of what the thing of God is, which for the most part, we don't have to think about too much because, well, we might think about it if we want to, but we also don't have to tell anyone about it, which is nice to a certain extent, that we can just believe in things and go on with our lives with it. It's not necessary to teach others about God unless we have this weird imperative to do so, which could be in a culture, could be in the religion itself, but also it doesn't have to be. You can have those beliefs inside of you, keep them bottled up. But that still gives us the idea of nature around that. And things that are above nature in this sense, well, it could be literally everything or anything. Any questions about this so far? Okay. Do you know who this is? Atlas. Who is Atlas? Sure. So what is he doing? Holding the earth? Seems very tired of it, but I guess it's a pretty heavy thing to do. Now, again, forget everything you know about science. And we're going to have to do a lot of that as we go, but this is kind of the way that we are thinking of the world here. How do you explain that the time is changing? How do you explain that day comes in at different times and night comes at different times? And how do you explain that sometimes it's cooler, sometimes it's warmer? How do you make sense of seasons? Could be that there's a person that's actually tasked with changing the seasons. And why wouldn't they? Because if you're living in nature and you're growing your own food, you know that things don't grow year round. When it's too cold, things don't grow. When it's too warm, things don't grow. When it's just warm enough, things grow. But then you need to harvest them at some point. But of course, if throughout the year, the weather was just warm enough to grow throughout the year, then you'd never stop working. Isn't God great that you can live your life with sometimes having more food, sometimes having less food? It has to be intentional. Somebody made this thing happen specifically for you, the people who grow things out of nature. And especially if you are thinking of the world in the way that the Greeks did, where you have not just one God, but several, this is a form of polytheism, then you can think of all the good things that God does for your life. In Sumer, for example, they had a god named Namu, who was the birth giver to heaven and earth. Now, the Sumerian civilization from 5, 6, 7,000 years ago gave the rise to many great generations after that. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, many other cultural groups are inspired by Sumerians, ancient Sumerians, I should say. And this birth giver God, who gives birth to both heaven and earth, also gave birth to a God of heaven and a God of earth. Now, what does that tell us about Namu, the birth giver of heaven and earth? All right, little thought experiment, because you don't know anything about science, we've established this. How does one person have a baby? Just a single person, just the one. Yes.
Pretty sure one person can have maybe.
Well, that's right. Most people can't, but this is a God. This is the birth giver of heaven and earth. And this particular God is both male and female, because that's the only way that you would be able to give birth to something. Well, in this case, practically enough for our purposes, of course, this particular God gives birth to one male God and one female God. One that's above earth, one that's on earth, and of course, those two give birth to the rest of the gods, because that's a pretty clear one. You have a boy and a girl, and those boys and girls can have kids. Now, there might be brothers and sisters, but that's not too important at this point. Eventually, you give birth to other gods, and you have these other gods that come together, especially Ninlil, the goddess of air, and Enlil, the god of storms. Again, pretty handy for us, one boy, one girl. Because you need to explain how the earth is working around you, and seems like a lot of work to carry the earth. It seems like a lot of work to carry the sky, so it needs a couple of other gods to explain how this air is working and how the air is working in different ways. And we're not going to go over the whole situation here, but as far as we know, Sumer had those 4 major gods plus 50 other great gods, and about 100 other minor gods after that, and even more people associated with their gods. So there's a sun god, a moon god, a mother earth, a lord of wisdom and water, a goddess of love and war, a goddess of darkness, gloom, and death. And the way you make sense out of this, the way most polytheistic people do, is that they have a pantheon of God, and so there's a hierarchy between those gods. So Ananke, the original son and daughter of the original God, gave birth to Enlil and Ninlil, another brother and sister god and successor to the original gods. And so you have the top god on top of everything, who oversees the whole situation, who's both a mother and a father to everyone. Then you have a mother and a father and a mother and a father and a sister and a brother, who look over the rest of the people, and everything else fits in this big picture. So you have the sun god that is in the air, and you have the moon god that is in the storm, and you have the earth itself that gives birth to people. And they have their stories, the stories of their lives. For example, Enlil, the god of storms, got a little too frisky with his sister, Ninlil, the goddess of air. And according to the Sumerian story, he raped her. Being the god of storms, he's an angry guy, and being a person who committed rape, he got kicked out of heaven. And when people give birth, more people relate to one another, more people get punished for the things that they do that are right or wrong. Well, you kind of learn that things are right or wrong from the stories that you tell about your gods. That rape is bad, cousin marriage is good. Things that you see as part of your original life story that is told to you through these characters that tell you how society works. Some things are okay to do because the gods did them. Some things are not okay to do because the gods got punished for doing that. Doesn't mean that they didn't do it because, of course, people are more or less fallible and gods could be more or less fallible. But as long as they're punished, we learn. As I mentioned, ancient Greeks were polytheists as well, and Greeks had their own pantheon of gods, especially two gods, Zeus and Hera, the king of gods and the queen of gods. Nothing above them. So from the very beginning of the Greek life story, there's a male and a female, and those male and female have kids. And they have kids in the shade of all of those, the underworld, the sea, the home, war, the hunt. Those kids have kids, and those kids are marrying one another and whatever. So you learn the things that are part of your life story from the story of these gods, and hopefully you can keep those things into a neat, okay story that is going to make sense for however long it needs to make sense. Our problem today, looking back at how the ancient Greeks did, and especially how ancient Sumerians did, is that most of what we have is the stories. We have the stories of the gods, and we have the stories that people told of their people, and we can connect those to a certain extent. But when you have stories that meet with one another, such as the ancient gods of Sumer, that becomes, again, Babylonians and Assyrians and whatever, and then you have the Greeks that are right next door. And the Greeks extend into the former Assyrian and Babylonian territory because Assyrians and Babylonians tended to conquer the entire area at some point. Then the stories get mixed, and you have those gods that are meeting with other gods, and then you have the Greek gods that become associated with Sumerian gods. They both do the same thing, so you have a god of the sea and you have another god of the sea, so those two have to be the same people. Why not? And as we'll talk about next week, the idea of ancient Greece as a country is pretty wrong, of course, because they didn't have a nation state the way we have it today. They had a cultural area where people spoke a language and generally believed in the same thing, but it was entirely possible that you had some cities in ancient Greece that believed in certain gods and other cities that believed in another god. And because, again, for the most part, they would never meet because they don't have to, they don't have any problems with that. So you have different stories of different gods doing different things, and you don't necessarily have to reconcile the stories. And if history works out so that the Greeks, ancient Greeks, are invaded by the new Babylonians and their new gods, then, well, the stories of the Babylonian gods tend to replace the stories of the ancient Greeks. And of course, that makes our story for archaeology and, the story of ancient people a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. But also pretty cool, because then you learn of how people get to live their lives, how to believe this thing or that thing. But that also extends our relationship to what we are calling the supernatural here. Because again, the sun, we generally understand as a big ball in the sky, but we don't have to think of it as a god of the sun so much. Because for our purposes, the sun is just out there. But when you're living in Palestine 5,000 years ago, the sun is a problem. The sun is what makes that you are living in a desert. And when you're living in a desert, your life is not exactly the same as living in a more or less temperate area as we are today. So having the importance of a sun god here is very different from our need for a sun god. Even though for all intents and purposes, if we did not have the sun, we would not be here. But, sun is going to be there. It is there right now. It has been there for a while. It's going to be there way after we're gone. So not much of a pressing matter to figure out the sun god. As opposed to our more pressing matters, the things that we may not be able to explain fully in our daily lives. Oh yeah, our life itself. Well, we have a mom and a dad, and that creates people, and that much is clear, at least until we figure out the science that allows people to have not a mom and a dad, which we can do now. But experiencing our life events and the things that happen in our life, births, deaths, disease, happiness, whatever, those things we cannot always explain fully, and sometimes it might be a little bit better to have a supernatural explanation for the things that happen. Why we had a job and then we lost it. Why we had a friend and then we lost it. Why we found a partner that is going to spend the rest of their life with them. Life. God made those things happen for a purpose of some sort. Something else. Some other thing happens in life. I don't know what it is. Plenty of things happen in life. Don't ask me. Ask the people who know what happens in life. It could be anything, literally anything. We don't even know if we're going to be alive tomorrow. But we are. And thank God we're waking up tomorrow. Because then what have we done so far that makes our lives worth living, Spend our days in classroom talking about stuff we don't care about? No, it's not fun. That's not good. It's not leading us anywhere. So having a God to make sense out of this is nice, that we're doing this for a reason, that there's a plan behind this. Until, of course, we die. And that one is also a pretty tough one to explain. Unless we have the supernatural that can explain why this is the way that it is. That, your time is your time, that weird disease that you got is part of something that makes sense to somebody somewhere. It can be chance, it can be a weird genetic lottery that made your life short and terrible. No. It has to be something bigger to make sense out of all this. And, again, the hurricanes, the political changes, the art that you saw that made you very happy or very sad or something. Explaining these things in some way or another means having some kind of experience that stretches our understanding a little bit further than we need to. And, again, if we are trying to live our lives, not having to ask ourselves those questions on a daily basis is kind of a load off our shoulders. Kind of like, not having to explain why the earth is turning, why the sun is up there, why seasons happen. It is a load off our shoulders that Atlas, the Greek god, is making all of this happen for us. That we don't have to worry about summer happening. That we don't have to worry about our next crop happening because the gods made it so. So we're going to have food and we're going to live past the next 6 months, assuming that we have a unit that allows us to measure months and seasons like that. But soon enough, those ideas come up with a new concept, a new conception because religion is pigeonholed into these gods and these pantheons, and especially the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians, and of course the Christians, both ancient and new, and the Muslims and the Jewish and the Hindus, and all of these weird science things that make sense out of religion in a way. But what about those other things that we can't explain, that we also don't want to impute to this God or that God? Maybe we don't know how we feel about those things. We don't want to commit to this God or that God. What if the other God's right? Then we made a mistake our whole lives, and that's another can of worms. So eventually our vocabulary, and especially for science, tends to revolve around the concept known as magic. Magic is the way that we can make sense of people in some way, applying the supernatural process to our life. And again, for our purposes, this is nice because we don't have to think about it too much. Things happen because magic. And we don't have to even see it to happen because, magic. Things happen. It's magic. It's magical. Things just happen. Magically. Now, for us today, when we think of magic, we think of, TV shows and the such. But that's just the way that we have made sense of magic because we have religion and we have a science of religion. We don't have much of a science of magic. Although, of course, religion is magic. And especially if you ask people who are religious, they'll tell you that these other guys are magic. We have the only religion that's worth believing. All these guys are magicians, sorcerers, witches, weirdos. We have the religion, they have the magic. But if you don't believe in any of that, then everything can be or could be magic, in the sense that everything can have a supernatural cause if you don't investigate it, if you don't feel like investigating it, or if you don't have the scientific tools to investigate it. But most of the time, when things come to magic, it has to do with associative thinking. Is that a thing is like a thing, and those things are linked by magic. And that exists in every society, wherever you look around the world. We'll get back to that pretty soon, because of course then develops a science around this, but at this point, we're just thinking of making sense of the world in magical ways. And of course, magic is very relatable because you don't have to explain it. You don't have to have a science behind it. You can just say, this is magic. And that answers all your questions. Kind of like you can say, God willed it, and this is the answer to all your questions. Except it doesn't have to be a God. It could be a God if you wanted to, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something else that you cannot explain. Something else that's not going to punish you for doing things the wrong way. So magic is really nice because it could be anything. It can be anything, really. And so by the 19th century, we have these explanations of magic that go around these associations. One of the first laws of magic that is identified in those years is the law of similarity. That things that look the same have a magical relations. Maybe they belong in the same group. Maybe they look similar enough that we can put them into the same box somehow. And as we have talked about in the context of language, for example, looking at the different colors and whether green is green or blue is blue, this is a very easy way to relate to those categories because people, as far as their brains are concerned, will see things more or less blue, more or less green, and put that into categories that make sense to them, to their experience, to their knowledge of what is green and what is blue. Well, here we have that same experience of things are kind of the same, so they are, for all intents and purposes, the same. So we all speak the English language, which means that we are connected through the magical English language. And so as a result of that, magic applying to one item can be transferred to the item that's most like it. can turn a thing into a magical thing by being similar enough. If you've ever heard that garlic is good for your heart, look at a clove of garlic. It looks like your heart. And that's the reason why this is. No science behind it. Complete nonsense. But if you've ever heard this, that means that this magical belief has stayed with us for all this time, just based on the way garlic looks and on the way the heart looks. This guy works based on the law of similarity. Do you know who that is? Pennywise? What's the story of Pennywise? Can you speak up so we can hear it? Over the magical jets flying over us? What's the story of Pennywise? He comes in at regular intervals, yes?
Only children can see him.
Only children can see him. Where do they see him? Sure. Do they see him at the circus where clowns typically are or something?
Just around.
So dark, weird spaces, things that you don't typically look in, things where you don't see a clown, right? Sewer grates like this one. Now you have this clown that looks fun, that looks cool, that is apparently a fun-loving person like most clowns are, that is only seen by kids who can see those specific things that make sense in the kids' world, and they do not see that he is actually a little bit more than a clown. He's actually a murderous clown that is going to kill you in the dark. Because what's in the dark? We don't know. Could be anything. Literally anyone could be waiting for you in the dark when you're a kid. And of course, if you live your life thinking that every dark corner of your life, of your house, of your street, of your city is a dangerous place, then the darkness could come in many shapes, including a murderous clown. Another explanation for magic is the law of proximity. Things that have a contact with one another are similar. You get similar by touch. You are bound by this magical link of being touched by a thing. And when you touch, you have a transfer of properties. You become more like that thing that you just touched. In which case, magic that applies to one's property will affect the person to whom it belongs. And this person became a new person by being touched by this thing. A different person, of course. A person you no longer recognize as the old person because they were changed by the contact. So when you go to your Asian restaurant and you touch the Buddha's belly, gives you good luck. Those things are making you closer to magic, closer to the supernatural, because you can literally touch a representation of it. You can touch the way that things are working. Therefore, you have this access to the supernatural. You have access to magic that you would not otherwise have. The rare occasion when you see those things, when you have access to those things, kind of, pushes you to make things work in your way, to do the right thing, the thing that you believe is the right one at the moment, like this guy. You know who this is? Chucky, the dog. How does Chucky work? Possessed by a serial killer. So what happens in the possession?
Like transfer his consciousness from himself to the doll.
Transferred his soul. So the serial killer transfers his soul into this doll. Then there's thunder and lightning, some weird preternatural elements. Breaks down the magical store in which this happens, and then somebody finds the doll. And then what happens? Chucky starts murdering people. Magical transfer of the soul of a murderous guy into a murderous doll gives this thing that didn't have any specific properties in itself. It was just an inanimate toy. But by being touched by the serial killer, now the toy becomes a serial killer. Now, what's interesting is that because Chucky exists in the 80s, this is happening according to a voodoo ritual. Voodoo is an actual belief system that exists in the world, but it has been used into a million ways, especially in Europe, to explain all kinds of magic. And here, of course, this is not how voodoo works, but this is how voodoo works in this movie. And you might have seen those voodoo dolls where voodoo dolls, for example, you put a pin in it, and the pin by contact affects the doll, which affects the person by contact. Or you have the similarity, of course, the doll looks like a person. Using the doll with an object such as a lock of their hair or whatever, the doll becomes that person, and you can affect that with magic. So magic is nice of a term here because it's very broad. It can be applied in a million ways. It can be applied to voodoo. It can be applied to Christianity. It can be applied to whatever thing. But the idea of magic became a nice term to affect anything that has to do with the supernatural. The problem being that we have all of this vocabulary that goes around our beliefs, whatever they are, and that we kind of need to break out of that vocabulary to make sense of how other people's beliefs work. And so whether we call it magic, whether we call it voodoo, or as we'll see on Thursday, what some people call animism, all those things become used and misused and grow away because we just don't know how to access other people's supernatural. We can make sense of our own sense of supernatural, whatever it is, but other people's supernatural, still a bit more complex. So language in this case is a little bit tough, but our concepts remain. The similarity, the proximity, the magic, the supernatural, those things are set in stone. Another word that becomes more complex for us is the word of a myth. Myth is especially used in anthropology to refer to things that are supernatural, stories of the supernatural, but whose value we don't attach any truth or falseness to it. Today, when we talk about myths, for the most part, it has to do with something that is false, and that's obviously not the case. We don't care whether or not the Bible is true or false. That's not the point of the Bible. It's not the point of religion. Literally, it is besides the point. The whole idea here is we are trying to make sense of things that we cannot explain as true or false. And we have a story for that. That's the myth. And also, of course, and that's mostly because of politics, When people talk about myths, it has to do with lies. And again, not the case. Who cares if it's a lie? This is literally not the point. The myth is something that is used for us to organize the sum of knowledge that we do not have. We have science that allows us to make sense of the knowledge we do have, and we put this into boxes and we make those classifications and such, and that is great. And myths are a scientific tool that makes us make sense of the things that we don't have tools for. So generally speaking, myths are traditional stories. Stories that are passed on within the culture to explain this or that part of our lives, this or that part of our God's lives, which eventually, reflects back to our lives. Which means that myths typically refer to those supernatural beings, the supernatural forces that we have mentioned so far. And you learn things through the myth that will hopefully have some kind of impact on you. Because if you're not learning anything from the story of gods, you're probably not going to remember that story, to be honest. You're not going to remember that this thing happened or that thing happened. Because why? Why are you going to bother learning about all the stories in everybody's lives when that changes nothing for you? There's so many songs by Gucci Mane you could be learning right now, and yet you're learning about the songs of Atlas in ancient Greece. Makes no sense. So myths are especially useful to us because they are important stories, and those stories are typically written somewhere, like the Bible, for example. The Bible is a myth, an origin story, a traditional story told by people for a very long time, and then eventually written down, which is ace for us. Because when people write down the stories, then we remember them a long time after those people are gone. And especially in the context of anthropology, there are people who are archaeologists whose job it is to dig into the past and to look at past cultures, past peoples, past books. And as we are speaking right now, there are archaeologists in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine that are looking for proof that the Bible is real or not real. Either way, still working on it though. And in that context here, the myth allows us to give a explanation, maybe a point of origin, maybe some kind of justification for something that you cannot explain. One of which being the early history of your people. How did your people come about? Well, this god had sex with that god, or this god had its own sex with itself because it's both male and female, and then gave birth to males and females, and then those males and females gave birth to more male and females, and, well, just more sex happens, and here we are. Long story short, it could also be the belief of the belief itself. Explain how your religion was born, how your magic became the magic that it is. That you have the story of how your people came to be believing in those stories. Or, of course, it could be explaining those natural phenomena that you could not otherwise exist, such as the myth we started today's lecture with, of the Shasta Indians talking about how you have these weird clouds that don't make any sense, because 10,000 years ago, when those stories were being told, they did not think of volcanoes. They did not think of air currents around the mountains that create these weird shapes. Especially because the volcano was alive at the time. And that volcano was a pain in their butts, growing crops for years at a time. How do you explain that? Well, some god came down from the heavens, made the stairs in the shape of a cloud, and stepped down on the volcano so that eventually the volcano just became a regular old mountain and was no longer a problem for us. Bless you. Any questions about this? Okay, if you missed the announcement at the beginning, don't forget that the instructions for the October paper is posted on Blackboard. Check it out as early as you can. Start working on that as soon as you can. It is due on Halloween night, the most anthropological of holidays. We'll be back here on Thursday.
Okay.